I always knew he was a good player. I think I spoke to Sam Allardyce a lot about him, and it was make sure everyone gets an equal opportunity to get into that position.
On the left-hand side, slotting in a talented player, but for me, I kind of want more, particularly when he was playing for Man United.
Did Patrick Vieira really call Gary Speed crazy? That's what the headlines want you to believe. But here's the truth. These so-called legends who hated Speed, they didn't hate him at all. In November 2011, the football world stopped. Gary Speed, at just 42 years old, had passed away. The shock was instant. The grief was universal. And in that moment of collective mourning, something remarkable happened. All those supposed rivalries, all that on-pitch aggression, all those fierce battles in the middle of the park suddenly revealed their true nature. They weren't about hate, they were about respect. The deepest kind of professional respect you can earn in football. Speed's death fundamentally changed how we understood his career and his relationships with other players. Because only hours before he died, Speed had been on television, relaxed and joking with former teammates like Gary McAllister and Alan Shearer. Gary Speed was a Premier League legend through and through. He played for 5 clubs during his career: Leeds United, Everton, Newcastle United, Bolton Wanderers, and Sheffield United. At each stop, he was celebrated for one thing above all else: his absolutely ferocious commitment to winning the midfield battle. Speed was the complete box-to-box midfielder, tracking back to defend, driving forward to create. He never stopped running, he never stopped fighting, and he never ever backed down from a challenge. But to understand why Speed's battles were so intense, you need to understand the world he played in. When the Premier League kicked off in 1992, English football was built on traditional strengths: physical power, mental toughness, and direct play. The tactics were simple. Almost every team played the same formation, a rigid 4-4-2, and in that system, the central midfield became the most important battleground on the entire pitch. The priorities were crystal clear. Managers wanted territory and tempo, not fancy passing patterns or patient build-up play. They wanted midfielders who could win the ball through sheer force, then move it forward quickly. The successful players were the ones who embraced physical confrontation as the primary path to victory. High-impact collisions weren't just expected, they were celebrated. This was the environment Gary Speed thrived in. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because being called nasty back then wasn't an insult. It was the highest compliment a midfielder could receive. Roy Keane, arguably the most feared enforcer of his generation, often reflected on his toughest opponents. And when he talked about Gary Speed and David Batty, he used one specific word repeatedly: nasty. Keane said Speed was a tough player to go up against, adding that he was pretty nasty. Batty was nasty too. Now, before we go deeper into these legendary battles, we want to hear from you. Who do you think was Gary Speed's toughest opponent on the pitch? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're there, hit that subscribe button so you never miss our deep dives into Premier League history. Understanding what Keane meant by nasty is crucial. In the context of 1990s Premier League football, that label meant you possessed the necessary ruthlessness and resilience to compete at the highest level. It meant you were willing to engage in constant physical battle against Manchester United, the league's most dominant force. This aggressive approach wasn't a character flaw, it was a survival skill. The tactical system itself demanded it. When you're playing box-to-box in a 4-4-2, you're constantly colliding with opposing midfielders in the middle third. You're winning tackles, you're breaking up attacks, you're orchestrating transitions forward. All of it requires maximum physical commitment. Being aggressive wasn't optional, it was essential, and Gary Speed was exceptionally good at it. Speed's long, consistent career meant he was a constant opponent to the dominant forces of Manchester United and Arsenal. This led to repeated, high-intensity battles with their midfield anchors, Roy Keane and Patrick Vieira. The rivalry between Speed and Keane defined central midfield warfare throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. It was rooted in classic club hostility. Manchester United against Leeds United, Manchester United against Newcastle United. These weren't friendly matches. They were wars, and Keane repeatedly confirmed that Speed was elite. He listed Speed among his toughest opponents, placing him alongside Alan Shearer and Patrick Vieira. Roy Keane was saying Gary Speed matched his intensity and quality. This wasn't an opponent, this was a peer. The specific confrontations between them showed just how extreme their duels could get. During a drop ball contest, Keane didn't just win possession, he physically levelled Speed before continuing his run forward. It was a statement of absolute dominance, the kind of moment that defined their relationship. But the competitive intensity didn't stop when the season ended. Keane tells a story about a charity match late in his career. Speed caught him with what Keane called a mistimed tackle, causing a severe ligament injury to Keane's ankle. The injury was so bad that Keane had to leave the pitch after just 8 minutes. His immediate reaction? A promise to see Gary Speed some other day. It was a classic professional threat, rooted in the desire for on-pitch retribution, not personal hatred. Keane later rationalised the injury, acknowledging that if he'd been fully fit, Speed wouldn't have caught him. This reveals something fascinating about their relationship. Keane frequently acknowledged that opponents like Speed and Batty were often the ones initiating contact. He said he was just retaliating over the years. This admission establishes that the aggression was a shared language, a mutual understanding. If Keane accepted that the physical baseline was set by players like Speed, then it validates Speed's approach as not just effective, but mutually respected. The antagonism was directed at opposing tactical objectives. Speed's ferocity was actually the highest form of professional compliment. They weren't enemies, they were warriors who understood each other perfectly. Then there was Patrick Vieira. Speed's teams, particularly Newcastle United between 1998 and 2004, were frequent challengers to Arsenal. This meant numerous high-stakes battles between Speed and Vieira. Both men were physically imposing, powerful midfielders who were central to their team's transitional play. Their confrontations were inevitable. Documentation confirms these direct duels, like Vieira closing down Speed during matches at Highbury. The physical intensity was undeniable, but here's what's revealing. The Speed versus Vieira battles lacked the constant personal drama that characterised the Keane versus Vieira rivalry. That famous feud was often amplified by media coverage, with tunnel confrontations and verbal exchanges captured on camera. Speed and Vieira's conflict remained primarily tactical and professional. The lack of sensational quotes about any personal feud between Speed and Vieira is actually evidence itself. Compared to the abundance of stories about Keane and Vieira's theatrical relationship, the Speed-Vieira dynamic stayed professional. Speed, known for his reserved character and deep humility, wasn't the type to engage in media spectacles. He let his play do the talking. His duels with Vieira remained strictly defined by professional objectives, avoiding the highly personalised conflict that followed other rivalries. This doesn't mean their battles were any less intense on the pitch. It just means they never became personal. So if these legends didn't hate Gary Speed, who were the ones who truly cared for him? The answer lies with his former teammates at Leeds United. The competitive relationships Speed maintained with David Batty and Gary McAllister were fundamentally different from those with Keane and Vieira because they were rooted in shared glory. All three were integral members of the iconic Leeds United midfield that captured the final English First Division Championship in 1992. That title-winning season forged bonds that would prove unbreakable, bonds that transcended any later club rivalry. David Batty was the defensive enforcer of that Leeds team. He shared a remarkably similar competitive temperament with Speed. Remember Roy Keane grouping them together, calling both of them tough and nasty? Both players embraced the aggressive, relentless style that defined successful midfielders in that era. They were forged in the same fire under manager Howard Wilkinson at Leeds. Although Batty and Speed later became opponents as their careers took different paths, the familiarity only intensified the tactical challenge. But crucially, the foundational partnership bond prevailed entirely over any professional antagonism. The most powerful evidence of their enduring friendship came in the aftermath of Speed's death. Batty emerged at Elland Road alongside Gary McAllister and Gordon Strachan in full view of the public to carry and lay wreaths before the commemoration match. This solemn, highly visible demonstration confirmed that the bonds of shared success were supreme. The image of these former champions, united in grief, told the real story, not hate, brotherhood. Gary McAllister served as the disciplined, creative central midfielder and captain for that title-winning Leeds side. He worked closely with Speed during their most defining success. Like Batty, McAllister continued his career at elite clubs, meaning he and Speed faced each other as opponents when McAllister played for Liverpool. But the connection between them extended far beyond professional rivalry into deep personal friendship. McAllister provided one of the most heartbreaking details surrounding Speed's death. He confirmed that he'd been joking with Speed just hours before the tragedy on a televised programme. Hours before Gary Speed died, he was relaxed, laughing, and connected with his old friend. This fact provides absolute proof that any competitive friction from their roles as opponents was completely superficial. McAllister's role in the public tributes was central. He participated alongside Batty and Strachan in the symbolic wreath-carrying ceremony at Elland Road, visibly demonstrating the profound emotional impact of Speed's loss. The collective identity forged during their triumph at Leeds completely superseded any competitive battles they fought later. In professional football, where rivalries create spectacle and drama, these early career bonds maintained absolute emotional supremacy. The contrast between Speed's aggressive competitive profile and his personal character is striking. Despite his reputation as a tenacious, nasty competitor on the pitch, Speed exhibited profound humility about his achievements. He famously cancelled an autobiography project because he didn't think he'd done enough to warrant a book. A Premier League legend who played over 500 league matches didn't think his story was worth telling. This self-effacement suggests that the ferocity seen on the field was a necessary professional mechanism, not a reflection of his gentle, principled character. The analysis of Gary Speed's relationships confirms something important. The premise of hate isn't just inaccurate. It fundamentally misunderstands the professional culture of elite Premier League football during the 90s and early 2000s. The relationships with his primary adversaries, Keane and Vieira, were defined by intense, relentless physical competition, but that competition was a mandatory requirement for survival and success. Keane calling Speed a tough player was professional validation of the highest order. The relationships with his former allies, Batty and McAllister, provided the ultimate counter-narrative. Despite facing each other as opponents later in their careers, the shared history of winning the 1992 title created an unbreakable bond. McAllister being with Speed in his final hours, Batty and McAllister carrying wreaths at Elland Road. These are definitive demonstrations that personal bonds held absolute priority. The immediate outpouring of respect following Speed's death served to instantly recast all professional antagonism into genuine reverence. Gary Speed's enduring legacy is defined not by the intensity of tackles he faced or inflicted, but by the uniform respect he commanded across the entire Premier League landscape. He was a fiercely aggressive, resilient player whose professional conduct was always underpinned by deep, unwavering humility. That's the real story, not hate, respect,